In the summer of 1875, 121 men ventured into the dense, towering pines of northern Michigan. They were loggers, hired by the ambitious Crescent Timber Company, promised pay beyond imagination, unaware of the forest's dark reputation. Locals whispered about it, that the trees were alive in ways that defied reason, that shadows moved without source, and that the ground swallowed men who dared tread too deep. The first 8 seconds of their march were ordinary, boots crunching on needles, axes swinging in rhythm. But by dusk, the forest had already claimed its first secret. One man never returned to camp. Another vanished by the creek, his screams swallowed by the wind. Fear spread, unspoken, among the remaining men, but the overseers dismissed it as nervousness, superstition. The forest's silence was unnatural. Birds avoided it. Wolves prowled, yet rarely howled. Something in the shadows watched, patient and knowing. By nightfall, the campfire light revealed strange carvings on trees, symbols no man recognized. They were not native nor man-made. And the men began to realize, the forest didn't just hide men. It preserved them. A diary later found, scorched at the edges, described a heartbeat beneath the soil and voices in the pines. "They are waiting," it read. And by the end of that first night, 112 men were missing. Only 9 remained, huddled together, their minds fraying, wondering if leaving the forest was a choice at all. The overseers of Crescent Timber were men of influence, men who had cultivated wealth by exploiting labor, land, and secrecy. Their journals, hidden in the company's Detroit office, reveal hints of rituals, contracts signed in blood, and payments not just in gold, but in silence. The logging camp itself was built with intent beyond timber extraction. Foundations were laid over old burial mounds, their sacred stones crushed beneath the weight of profit. Some men whispered about the old man of the pines, a ghostly figure who appeared before each tragedy, face obscured by bark-like skin, speaking in whispers that twisted dreams into nightmares. Families of missing men never received answers. Letters went unanswered. Townsfolk who asked questions were met with a cold smile or sudden departure. The forest became a container, a trap where commerce, superstition, and fear intertwined. The 9 survivors later described seeing shapes move between the trees, human, yet elongated, impossible. They claimed the forest had a rhythm, a pulse, guiding them towards certain deaths. No one could explain why 9 survived while 112 perished. Some blamed luck. Others said the forest chose, testing men as though they were seeds. The overseers, however, understood. They had contracts older than the company, dealings with men whose names were forgotten, but whose power endured. To walk into the forest was to gamble against forces unseen, and the forest always won. John Evers, one of the 9 survivors, kept a diary detailing the descent into terror. Its pages were water-stained and smudged, but one line captured the essence. Every tree watches. Every shadow waits. And when they touch you, you do not return. Evers described men disappearing while chopping wood, their screams trailing into the night, then stopping abruptly, as if the forest inhaled them whole. At times, he heard them calling, voices familiar, pleading for rescue. Yet when he turned, the air was empty. One night, the survivors discovered a pit, roughly human-sized, carved into the earth with precision. Inside were personal items, hats, boots, even a pocket watch, all from men who had vanished weeks prior. No bodies, only possessions, as though the forest had collected trophies. Hunger and fear drove the men closer together. Yet paranoia grew faster. Evers wrote of seeing men turn on each other, accusing their companions of summoning the forest's wrath. Some tried to flee, only to be found hours later in circles, muttering incomprehensible phrases. The diary ends abruptly. The final pages describe a ritual performed out of desperation to appease the waiting ones. Some historians later speculated the ritual mirrored forgotten indigenous ceremonies, but twisted, corrupted, commercialized by men who did not understand the power they invoked. In the nearby town of Ironwood, whispers persisted long after the logging camp burned to ashes. Families remembered sons, husbands, and brothers who left for work in the forest and never returned. Old-timers spoke of seeing strange lights among the trees. Even decades later, and hearing a faint echo of axes and shouts on nights when the wind carried just right. Churches held special vigils, praying for the souls of those lost. Some priests reported visions, spectral men wandering silently through the pulpit, or the sound of a choir of voices coming from the forest. One deacon claimed the forest sang, not with joy, but with lamentation, as if it mourned each man it took. Yet the town's records tell a different story. The Crescent Timber Company was absolved of wrongdoing. Official reports cited accidents, misadventure, and disease. And gradually, the truth was buried beneath legal documents, town expansion, and economic growth. The forest remained, though, a silent witness, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Even the descendants of survivors avoided speaking of it. Family dinners, local schools, and township meetings became repositories of quiet fear, an inherited anxiety that no one dared articulate aloud. The town learned early that to question the forest was dangerous, but to forget it entirely was impossible. Something lingered there, patient, always watching. As the years passed, folklore grew. Children were warned not to wander near the edge of the forest. Hunters spoke of movements just beyond the trees, impossible to trace. Dogs refused to enter certain groves. Horses shied violently near the old campgrounds. The 9 survivors told fragmented tales in hushed tones, each recounting visions of shapes, tall, skeletal, with eyes like molten gold, moving silently between the pines. They described hearing their own names whispered from the shadows, voices they had not spoken aloud in decades. One survivor, George Mallory, claimed the forest followed him. Wherever he moved, he saw its silhouettes, even in cities far away. He grew thin, frail, haunted, until his death in 1902, muttering about the tally of the lost and the counting of the trees. Researchers later discovered that the camp's grid pattern matched no practical timber extraction plan. It aligned instead with constellations and ley lines, as if the forest's layout had a purpose beyond human comprehension. Some speculated the logging operation had unwittingly unearthed a portal, a place where natural law bent to ancient, vengeful rules. And so, the forest endured, a living tomb, swallowing men, memories, and time itself. Those who survived bore the weight of what they had seen, and the chilling certainty that the forest was patient, immortal, and deliberate in its hunger. Weeks after the initial disappearances, the 9 survivors stumbled upon a clearing unlike any natural formation. The ground was unervingly soft, almost spongy, and tree roots spiraled unnaturally, forming geometric patterns. At the center, a massive stone altar stood, blackened by years of unknown fires. Carvings on the altar were disturbingly detailed. Men in agony, trees with human faces, and animals contorted into impossible forms. The survivors realized that this was no ordinary logging site. Someone, or something, had been here long before them, shaping the land, bending reality to a purpose that had nothing to do with timber. Ever's diary recounts that at night, the clearing seemed to breathe. Shadows stretched across the men, reaching with impossible speed. Some claimed to see faint shapes crawling along the ground, creatures that were neither human nor animal. Their eyes glowed, reflecting a hunger that was patient, eternal. The men tried to flee, but the forest disoriented them. Paths they had walked hours before twisted into labyrinths. Time itself seemed to falter. Night lingered too long, while days passed unnoticed. The forest had its own rules, and survival depended not on strength, but on understanding, and the men did not understand. By morning, the clearing was empty. The altar remained, silent, but the sense of being watched never left. One man whispered, "It knows we're here, and it remembers." Through fragmented journals and scorched papers, historians later pieced together that the logging company may have stumbled upon ancient rituals, long buried and forgotten. The men unknowingly performed acts that mirrored these rites, awakening forces they could neither see nor comprehend. The rituals were not ceremonial in the conventional sense. Instead, they were a language of the forest itself, cuts on trees, stacked stones, patterns in mud. The forest responded to these signs, bending its environment and controlling the minds of intruders. The 9 survivors experienced visions, twisted processions of men marching silently, women whispering in the wind, children with hollow eyes laughing without sound. These hallucinations were more than psychological. They were warnings, attempts to teach men the forest's rhythm. By the third week, the survivors had begun marking trees themselves, instinctively, hoping to navigate the maze. But the markings changed when no one was looking, forming new paths, new messages. The forest was alive, intelligent, deliberate. Evers wrote, "We are not in the forest. The forest is in us." And with each passing day, the men felt that the forest's will was seeping into their very bones, twisting memory, identity, and sanity. Investigations decades later revealed that the Crescent Timber Company had a pattern. This forest was not their first sight. Journal entries hinted at prior logging camps, mysteriously abandoned, with entire crews vanishing. Names of towns and families reappeared like a network of secrecy, with gaps and omissions suggesting deliberate erasure from history. Locals recalled the camps with dread. Some remembered seeing the company's men transporting crates marked with strange symbols. Inside were not logs, but artifacts, bones, masks, carved figurines. Scholars later speculated these items were offerings, part of an ongoing transaction between human ambition and ancient forces. Families of the disappeared carried generational trauma, passed down in hushed tones. The logging camp had become a nexus of fear and suppression. It exposed the darkest side of industrial expansion. When greed intersects with the forgotten, horrors manifest, and no law can intervene. In the diary, Evers describes one night where the forest seemed to speak directly, "Do not leave, and do not return. We are patient, and we are many." The words were not written, they were etched into the air itself, felt deep in the chest, impossible to ignore. The survivors began to fray under the forest's weight. Sleep became impossible, dreams merged with reality. Evers documented men talking to shadows, accusing companions of conspiring with the forest. Arguments erupted over nothing, only to collapse into tears of guilt and fear. Some men attempted to escape in secret, only to reappear days later at the center of the clearing, bruised, scratched, and silent. When questioned, they claimed the forest had taught them, though what lesson they had learned remained unclear. One man, Thomas Harlow, described a vision of a great tree, its roots entwined with countless faces, all screaming. He claimed it whispered, "You are not alone. You are everything." By morning, he was catatonic, staring at the trees as if seeing into another dimension. Evers' writing turned increasingly erratic. Letters formed symbols instead of words. Sentences looped endlessly on pages. He described hearing his own name called from behind trees, by men he knew were dead. The forest's control was subtle, psychological, and absolute. By the 6th week, survival was no longer a matter of food or water. It was a battle to preserve one's mind, one's sense of self, against an intelligence older than any man could imagine. The 9 who ultimately emerged did so by accident, instinct, or the forest's design. One survivor described walking for hours, only to find the forest thinning at dawn, as if it had released them deliberately. Each carried a piece of the forest with them, scars, strange markings, and an unshakable dread. Historians later analyzed the 9 men. They were changed, not just physically, but in the way they perceived reality. Each refused to speak of the forest in detail, yet their silence told a story of trauma, of knowing something the world was never meant to comprehend. Families reported that even years later, the survivors would wake screaming, muttering about trees that moved, shadows that whispered, and men who walked among the pines after death. Some suggested the 9 had been chosen by the forest to bear witness, to pass down warnings in fragmented tales. Others suspected the Crescent Timber Company manipulated events, ensuring that only select men survived to maintain secrecy. And so, the forest endured. The men carried its memory, the town carried its whispers, and history, carefully edited, continued, leaving a dark secret behind, waiting for the curious, the ambitious, or the foolish to enter and be claimed once more. The forest, according to the survivors, had a memory. Paths they walked days earlier shifted, as if the trees themselves had rearranged themselves to confuse or punish. One man swore he saw the stump of a tree he had chopped down months before, now standing tall and unscarred. Evers wrote in his diary that the forest seemed aware of intentions. A man who tried to run was confronted by shadows that mirrored his every movement. Those who spoke lies or concealed fear reported hearing whispers echoing their guilt back at them in voices they had never recognized but instinctively knew. Local folklore later hinted at the forest's sentience. Hunters spoke of hearing cries of the missing, a chorus of despair that rose and fell with the wind. The survivors recalled that even the animals behaved strangely. Deer stared with unblinking eyes, owls circled unnaturally, and wolves avoided paths they once roamed freely. It became apparent that the forest did not simply consume men. It taught, manipulated, and recorded. Every act, every misstep, every fear was cataloged. Those who emerged carried not just scars, but the forest's knowledge embedded in their minds, a knowledge too heavy for any ordinary life. And the men realized a chilling truth. The forest had no deadline, no mercy. It would wait centuries if it needed to, reshaping men, reality, and memory alike. In Ironwood, decades after the disappearances, whispers persisted in churches, taverns, and town halls. Some townsfolk reported seeing figures among the trees, even in the edges of fields far from the original camp. Others claimed to hear chains, axes, and muted screams on still nights. Churches attempted to document these phenomena, framing them as moral lessons or divine warnings. Sermons warned against greed, ambition, and disrespecting nature. But parishioners understood the unspoken message. The forest claimed those who trespassed on its ancient domain. Descendants of the missing men reported dreams of the forest. Fathers awoke screaming about axes in motion, unending shadows, and men walking without bodies. Mothers found children drawing spirals of trees and faces they had never seen. The forest's influence seeped beyond the boundaries of the camp, leaving a psychological imprint across generations. The town's official history remained silent. Reports and journals were filed, burned, or buried. Yet stories survived, muted, fragmented, like a suppressed song. People knew the forest was waiting, patient, intelligent, and aware of anyone who dared probe its secrets. Evidence later uncovered in the Crescent Timber Company's archives suggested that the forest had been entwined with human ambition long before 1875. Diaries, contracts, and accounts revealed patterns. Every camp was arranged not for efficiency, but to align with geomantic lines, burial grounds, and the natural flow of the forest's energy. Men who understood these patterns survived longer. Those who ignored them disappeared quickly. Evers described one night where a man attempted to defy the forest by walking in a straight line to the river. He was gone by dawn, leaving only his hat and boot behind. The survivors tried to replicate protective patterns, circles, carved symbols, and makeshift altars. Sometimes these measures worked temporarily, allowing a man to rest, eat, or navigate the forest. But the forest adapted, shifting subtly, waiting for moments of weakness or despair. In essence, the forest was not a passive force. It was an institution of control, ancient and relentless. The men were instruments in its unseen design, learning that human effort alone could not prevail. As the 9 survivors returned to civilization, their memories of the forest were fragmented, unreliable, and horrifyingly vivid. Evers wrote of waking in rooms he had never entered, hearing the whispers of men lost to the trees, and feeling the pulse of the forest beneath the floorboards. Historians and psychologists later examined the survivors' testimonies. Many showed signs of trauma consistent with extreme isolation, hallucinations, and survivors' guilt, but there was a common thread: memories of impossible phenomena that defied natural law. Trees that moved, shadows that listened, sounds from nowhere. The survivors attempted to integrate into towns and families, but the forest persisted in their minds. Dreams overlapped with reality. Names of the lost whispered in the wind. Objects shifted slightly, just enough to unsettle perception. Evers concluded, "Even when I am away from the forest, it is inside me. I do not walk alone. The forest walks within." This psychological haunting was as terrifying as any physical danger, proving that the forest's power extended beyond mere geography. It reshaped the very minds of those who dared trespass. The Crescent Timber Company's records, pieced together from surviving fragments, revealed a disturbing pattern. Every logging camp they established was aligned with sites of ancient, forgotten activity. Workers disappeared in clusters, never randomly, but in sequences, suggesting design, not accident. Survivors spoke of seeing other men in the forest, figures from prior decades, somehow preserved, wandering in trance-like states. These apparitions sometimes guided or misled the living, creating cycles of survival and disappearance that repeated over generations. The forest operated like a sentient grid, selecting who would vanish, who would survive, and who would bear witness. Families of the lost received minimal compensation, as though the company had quietly bribed silence, perpetuating the myth of natural accident while the forest continued its work. The men who survived were forever altered. Their physical health remained, but their psychological and spiritual selves were fractured. Many never spoke of what they witnessed, fearing disbelief, ridicule, or worse, the forest itself. The forest's influence, subtle but persistent, endured in towns, churches, and families, proving that some horrors are not contained. They ripple outward, touching generations, shaping lives long after the trees have consumed their first victims. The forest had a rhythm, and the survivors learned to feel it. Each whisper of wind, each shift of shadow, each creak of branch was a message, warning, or command. Some nights, the trees themselves seemed to pulse with life, their bark rippling as if breathing. Evers recorded the most harrowing night. The shadows coalesced into figures, human in form but grotesque in movement. They did not speak. They communicated directly, planting fear, memory, and guilt into the men's minds. One by one, the survivors felt their identities fray. They remembered faces that never existed, voices that called from graves that were never there. By now, the men no longer distinguished the forest from themselves. One tried to carve his name into a tree, only to see the letters rearranged into a warning: "You are ours." Forever. Panic surged. Each heartbeat sounded alien, in tune with the unseen rhythm that governed the woods. The forest's hunger was not merely physical. It demanded obedience, recognition, and memory. Survival required submission, or risk joining the tally of the lost. The 9 realized the cruelest truth: leaving the forest was not freedom. It was a transfer of responsibility, the forest following quietly, eternally, into lives already claimed. Decades later, investigators uncovered evidence that the Crescent Timber Company had knowingly exploited the forest's power. The overseers had signed contracts with unnamed, shadowy figures, ancient custodians, spirits, or forces older than the United States itself. Each logging operation was an experiment in control, using men as instruments to awaken and feed the forest. The forest, in turn, rewarded obedience, punishing dissenters with disappearance. The 9 survivors were both witnesses and messengers. Their survival was deliberate, a calculated act by the forest and the overseers alike. They were to return to towns, silently warning future generations, while the truth remained hidden beneath economic ambition and fear. Evers' final entries hinted at this understanding. The overseers knew. They bowed to the forest, but it bowed to nothing. It waits. The forest's pact extended beyond timber, beyond humans, beyond morality. It was timeless, omnipresent, patient, ensuring that some men survived only to carry the weight of knowing. The townsfolk noticed changes in the families of survivors. Children were unusually quiet, attuned to silences and shadows others ignored. Parents whispered warnings about distant forests, even in places where no forest existed. Some descendants experienced visions, fleeting images of men wandering between impossible trees, voices calling from nowhere, and shadows that moved independently of light. Families became repositories of trauma, each generation inheriting fragments of what the forest demanded they remember. Evers' children reported waking in the night, listening to trees in the wind, even in urban neighborhoods. They would draw spirals, circles, and patterns instinctively, as if encoding a language the forest had implanted in their DNA. The forest's influence proved inescapable. Even when the logging camp fell to ruin and the company dissolved, its dark legacy endured, embedded in minds, homes, and collective memory. The town learned the hard way. Some places, some forces, are never abandoned. They follow, patiently, waiting for those curious enough to look too closely. By the early 1900s, the 9 survivors had scattered, carrying fragments of the forest's memory with them. Some wrote diaries, fragmented accounts, or letters never sent. Others lived in silence, afraid of attracting the forest's attention by speaking aloud. They described strange phenomena, trees appearing in dreams in impossible configurations, shadows mimicking their own movements, whispers in uninhabited rooms. They realized they were conduits, vessels for the forest's will, chosen to carry warnings across time. One survivor, George Mallory, described standing on his porch in 1898, hearing a chorus of lost men calling from an invisible forest. He understood then that leaving the forest did not end the ordeal, it merely relocated it. The forest walked within him, shaping his thoughts, his fears, his very existence. Evers ended his final diary with a chilling line. "We live outside, but the forest never leaves. And it waits, always. The forest remains, centuries old, patient and unyielding. Modern explorers, hikers, and townsfolk still whisper about shadows that move without source, paths that shift, and the echoes of men who vanished long ago." The Crescent Timber Company is gone, but its records reveal a blueprint for control, exploitation, and survival intertwined with the supernatural. The forest's tally continues, unseen but inexorable, marking men, families, and towns for generations. The story of 121 men, 9 survivors, and countless lost souls is more than history. It is a warning. Some places, some forces, are beyond understanding, beyond law, beyond morality. The forest exists not only in Michigan, but in the memory of anyone who dares to trespass into the forbidden, into the forgotten, into the dark heart of human curiosity. And so, the forest waits. Patient, eternal, hungry.